we're very, very proud to have her on our stages. And tonight, I'm looking forward to this, her talk is titled, "What the heck is blockchain and why should I care?" Please put your hands together for Helen Disney. So, if you just wave your hand.
Okay, good evening everybody. I hope everyone can hear me up at the back. I have the dubious honour of being the last speaker, which means I'm literally the only thing standing between you and the beer and the snacks. So if it gets too bad, just feel free to come forward to the front. But first of all, I can't start without saying thank you to the organisers. Natalie's a fantastic person who I've known for a little while now, and she and I started talking a lot about storytelling and how there's not enough storytelling in blockchain and explaining what this technology is in a way that humanises it and makes it interesting and makes it accessible for people. What she's doing and what Susan is doing with these events, I think, is trying to bring that out. So I'm really grateful for them inviting me, first of all, and also to the other two speakers. I'm really humbled to be alongside Christiana and Anna because I always think it's admirable when people admit to their flaws, first of all, and I'm going to admit to some of mine in my talk, one of which is when I was younger, I absolutely hated public speaking, and I can still remember the first time I did a speech in front of people. It was in secondary school, and we had to give some kind of a book report. I was absolutely purple in the face, my legs were kind of shaking like jelly, I wanted to wet my pants, basically. And I kind of thought to myself after this is the worst, most humiliating, horrible thing I've ever had to do, and I'm going to basically spend my life trying to avoid people looking at me or speaking in public. And now what I do for a living is go around giving talks. So things have come a long way since I was 12, 13 years old. But it takes a long time to kind of get through that nervousness, and I know a lot of people have it. I know a lot of women have it, which is why they don't put themselves forward to do talks. So all the more we can do to encourage people to do that and to talk particularly about tech, which is a kind of neglected area for women. So really happy to meet Christiana and hear what she's done, and also to change perceptions of a girl, a young woman, very talented, coming from Hackney, and maybe people wouldn't think that she would end up going to Silicon Valley or being in FinTech. I've got 2 kids who are at school in Hackney right now, and my son goes to a local secondary school, and they were being asked, what were their favourite foods, and pretty much everyone said, my mum's lasagna, my mum's curry, my mum's whatever, and my son said, my mum doesn't really cook. She's too busy teaching people about blockchain. So I didn't really know whether I should be embarrassed, that I don't really cook for my kids, or whether I should be proud that I'm being seen as an entrepreneur. But mostly I was happy that he was changing perceptions among a group of kids who maybe wouldn't think that the mum was a person in the family that went out and ran a business. So just to tell you a little bit about what I do, this is Unblocked. I started the company 2 years ago to really do exactly what it says on the tin, which is unblock the subject of blockchain, teach people what it is, why it's interesting, and actually particularly why it's not always to do with financial services and financial technology. So I'm going to be the one that's not going to talk about capital markets or really about payments, but more about how blockchain is applied outside of the finance sector. And so what I do is run one-day events in particular themes like healthcare or energy and environment or the creative industries or philanthropy, explaining how blockchain companies are kind of disrupting different aspects of those sectors. And I also spend quite a bit of time, as mentioned, on the policy side, trying to teach people in public life about blockchain. Why do I do that? Because most of my career before I got involved in this crazy world of blockchain was in public policy think tanks and in the media. And one of the things you do when you work in think tanks, it's one of those weird things, a think tank, what the hell is a think tank? It makes you think that there's all these kind of very clever people sitting around, and when you do careers advice at school, no one says to you, you should go and run a think tank or go and work in a think tank. But what you actually do often is take something complicated or seemingly boring and technical that people don't know much about and try and package it up and sell the ideas and the messages behind that policy or that problem that's being solved. And that's kind of how I ended up teaching people about blockchain, because I saw there were a lot of similarities with what I was doing before, and that those stories weren't really being told. And there was a kind of a big yawning gap between the great technologists and the great innovators, and then the people running ordinary businesses in the kind of mainstream companies or in public life who just knew nothing about this technology, and also it was very, very difficult for them to dig in and find out what it really meant for them. So that's kind of how Unblocked came about. And I think, my dad probably thought I'd gone a bit mad because, I rang him up and I said, I'm starting this thing, it's called Unblocked. And he thought I was, somehow starting up some kind of a plumbing company. And he knows I'm not very good with my hands, so he was probably wondering why on earth I was doing that. And obviously plumbing is also a male-dominated sector, but I think my talents are probably better used in blockchain. So if we move to the next slide, I put this up because I've probably spent the last 4 to 5 years really kind of being a blockchain bully, maybe more than a blockchain guru. Although when I talk about guru, I use it in the sense of a teacher and an educator rather than a sort of weird cult leader. But there are some cultish aspects to the cryptocurrency and blockchain world. But, why do I go on and on about blockchain? It's not because I think that it's, riveting to talk about technology, because there are many, many technologies, and often people aren't really that interested in the technology itself. I mean, some people in this room probably are, but for most people, they're interested in what the technology can do for them, what problem can it fix. And so when I first started getting involved in this, it was because I got involved in a big conference in Amsterdam back in 2014, which was the first big kind of Bitcoin event, which really launched Bitcoin to the kind of mainstream audience. And it was a very strange affair where you had kind of 1,000 people, of which about 25 were kind of bankers and lawyers and people in suits, and then a whole bunch of other people in hoodies, trainers. There was a woman with long floor-length kind of blonde bleached dreadlocks, and then some people walking around kind of wondering, what on earth am I doing here? I've come from Brussels, or, I've come from a bank and I don't really know, why I'm here and what I'm doing. And that was that kind of yawning gap, which has evolved enormously in the past few years, but I've spent a lot of time trying to kind of fill in that gap by being a bit of a blockchain bully. So I wanted to start by just seeing who's kind of already knowledgeable about blockchain in the audience and who considers themselves sort of a blockchain beginner who would like to learn more, because we've talked about blockchain a bit already tonight, but maybe some people still have questions about what it actually is. So can you sort of stick your hand up if you think you're a blockchain beginner? Okay. And anybody who considers themselves very sort of technically expert in blockchain?
A bit scared after a while.
Okay. Anyone who wants to put themselves in the middle of being a beginner and a complete expert? Okay. All right. So we have a good range, but probably a lot of people here still have questions about blockchain. So what I wanted to start with really is just talk about where it came from. So we heard before the Bitcoin white paper. It's nearly 10 years old since Bitcoin was launched. And that was really where blockchain started. So what was blockchain? It was the Bitcoin blockchain. And it was a way of kind of keeping track of all the transactions on the Bitcoin network. So you can kind of think, if you want to use a sort of banking analogy, you can think about it like a giant bank statement of all the transactions that have ever taken place on a network. And it's open. You can go online now and go to a block explorer and see all the transactions kind of ticking along. And so what that allowed us to do was, first of all, just to have this kind of almost like an audit trail or an online shared diary of what was going on. And that's very interesting, because then suddenly you've got this kind of ledger of what's happening. And it's a huge computing project. You can see some of the different definitions that people use, and Anna referred to Don Tapscott's book, which I highly recommend. So, suddenly you've got this kind of trust mechanism, if you like, this way of everyone knowing what's going on at the same time. And that can be used for payments. So Bitcoin is a revolution because we can do peer-to-peer transactions. I can send money to you directly without needing a bank or a credit card company in the way. And in the past, we couldn't do that, because if you're, let's say, another part of the world, or even if you're in the next room from here and you don't know the other person, how are you going to trust that person to send you money without someone else verifying that the transaction is going to take place? But once you've got this cryptographically secure network, you can actually do these peer-to-peer transactions. So that in itself is a huge revolution. But when you take that further and you think, okay, well, hang on a minute, we've got this kind of a ledger, we've got this kind of bank statement, maybe we can use that system to keep track of other things, not just money, but what about other types of assets? Maybe it's data, which is becoming, the kind of asset that we all trade in, really. If you look at Facebook and Google and others, why are they so successful? It's because they have data. So maybe blockchain is really a tool for data management, or it's a tool for keeping track of other types of assets that we have and digitizing those and maybe dealing with them in a different way. And so that's where I kind of started to get really interested in this, because I thought, well, I used to be a journalist, and I can see that no one wants to pay for information anymore. The media is going downhill. We're not really paying for kind of journalism and information in the way that we used to. And someone at the original conference was doing a project where they were trying to do micropayments with Bitcoin, which it's been very difficult in the past to do micropayments for newspaper articles because of credit card commission. But they were also looking at taking that more broad and saying, well, look, if we get up some data, or the people using the system maybe are able to sell their data to us and we know their preferences, maybe we can drive different kinds of services for our readers and our customers. And as a former journalist, I thought, well, that's really fascinating. Maybe that's the future of the media. Maybe it's really, really important, because if we live in a society where we're not willing to pay for information and we don't trust the information we have, then that's a really bad thing for the world. So I got interested in that. Then I started getting interested in other things like healthcare and so on, but I'll come on to that in a minute. So these are just some basic definitions of blockchain. The Economist called it the trust machine. This is a sort of bit of a disputed term. Some people don't like the term trust machine because they say you can't always trust what goes into a database, and a blockchain is really a kind of a database. But on the other hand, I think it is instructive in the sense that what you've got is the ability to know what people in a network are doing. And those people can be all around the world. And that's something that we couldn't really do in the past. So I do think the trust machine has some good elements to it, but I prefer this word, the incentive machine, which wasn't made up by me, but by another developer who's expert in blockchain. And why do I say it's an incentive machine? It's because suddenly you've got a global network which is distributed, so it can be anywhere. It's very easy to send money frictionlessly, it's secure, you don't have anyone else in the way. So what you can start to do with that is you can start to kind of create communities of interest with common goals. So it could be something really simple. Let's say you want to build a community garden and you want to know, okay, we're going to raise money for this, and probably we've got a local community of people who would like to pay for that. And we've got certain things we want to do. We might want to build a fence, we might want to get some contractors in to build the fence. How can we do all of that, automate it, know that we're not going to pay the money out to the contractors unless they've actually completed the task? Maybe we could do that using a blockchain and a smart contract, and this smart contract would be kind of a set of instructions that would say, we're only going to pay the contractor when we know the fence has been built, and then the money that's been donated will be issued. So all of that can be done. But what if there were other people around the world that wanted to contribute to that as well? Suddenly, you could find those people and you could get them to pay you in a very easy, frictionless way, and they could have a stake in a project like that, which could become much bigger. And it could be used for all kinds of other things as well. If we look at healthcare, perhaps raising money for rare diseases where you've got an individual child that needs help, but also a wider community that want to contribute to that research. So there's a lot of different things involved in that, but that's just a kind of an idea of how you can start to see this is much, much bigger than just finance and payments, and it's maybe more of a social revolution. I go to the next slide. So going back to the fall of trust, I mean, one of the reasons I get interested in blockchain for public services, which is where I spend a lot of my time talking, is this issue of the fall of trust. And, you know, we've all seen these kind of cartoons. I mean, this is a little bit of a joke, but, you know, we want to cut back on bureaucracy, we want to cut back on paperwork. There's reams of bureaucracy in many industries, not just in the public sector, but in banking, in insurance, in many, many other areas. And I was talking to someone who runs a blockchain healthcare project in the US in the public sector, and he said when he first started his job, he came to his office and there was just a box of passports sitting in the corner of the room. And he's a lawyer, and he thought to himself, you know, the last thing I want is the liability of these kind of passports sitting in the corner of the room. I need to find some way to get rid of these passports, and for people who are verifying their credentials as doctors to not have to send physically a passport to my office. So that was his motivation to start exploring blockchain. And so we can get rid of a lot of that bureaucracy, but we can also start to make things much, much more efficient and much more accountable when we deal with public services. And if you think about, you know, many areas where we interact today, whether it's banking, whether it's, I already mentioned, the media, whether it's public services, you know, we give our money over, but we don't always have any accountability, or we don't have enough accountability over what's happening with it. So if you look at something like charitable donations, often there's a huge chain of transactions that goes on in a charity to send money from, let's say the UK government donates something, it goes via a big charity like Oxfam, it ends up in Africa, they donate it to another smaller partner there, then it goes to somebody else. And through that chain, you don't really know where the money is going, who's taking hold of it, and how much is being used for bureaucracy and admin, how much is maybe getting wasted, and how much is actually going to the good cause. So blockchain's starting to kind of dive into these areas where we want to use money for good. We want to use our taxes to pay for services that are really efficient, not wasting it on all of admin and bureaucracy. We want our charitable donations to be something that we can account for and we can do something good with. And I think that's a really important part of what blockchain is starting to do. We go to the next slide. So I think it's much more than a new tool. I mean, you've probably already guessed that from what I've said, but you could just see it as a really useful technology, as a tool, as a kind of part of a toolbox of things that you can do with. And it's gone from being more than just cryptocurrency. When you talk about blockchain, it's not just about Bitcoin or about other cryptocurrencies. It's really about much wider applications of the technology. So it's not just an IT solution. It's kind of a whole app store now rather than just an app, if you think of Bitcoin as the killer app of a blockchain. But I think it's a new mindset. And we touched on the ATM before. I think someone mentioned it. But every time you get a new technology that creates a new mindset, you have a kind of a revolution. You have upheaval, some of it good and some of it maybe people are scared and they're frightened and they see risks. So we had tally sticks, and when tally sticks were abolished, there was a social revolution. When the ATM came along, people kind of said, the hole in the wall, that's what my parents used to call it when we were kids, the hole in the wall. Like, what a weird idea, getting our money out of this kind of, plastic thing in the wall. That seems weird. Why can't I just go into the branch and see a real physical person to get my money out? So it's not surprising that when people hear about blockchain or about cryptocurrencies, they're very dubious. And certainly for me, when I started doing this, the vast majority of people I spoke to about what I was doing said, why on earth would you give up, perfectly successful, reputation and career, working in public policy, working as a journalist for the Times, and go and start hanging out with all these drug dealers and these weirdos and these tech geeks and these, kind of money launderers and all these bad people that are dealing with Bitcoin. They're really horrified with me. It's like, Helen's kind of lost her mind. She's like this woman in her 40s, and she kind of, when she's having a midlife crisis or something, she's going to do this. And I kept on having to say to myself, I know there's more to this than what other people are saying to me, but it takes a while to convince people that what you're doing is not completely crazy. And hopefully now they're starting to see that I hadn't actually had a moment of madness. So we sometimes hear the word blockchain. We sometimes hear the word distributed ledger. You might have heard that. I've already kind of referenced it in my talk. So a blockchain is a type of distributed ledger, but not all distributed ledgers are blockchains. What's happening now is, in a way, you're getting a whole bunch of different types of distributed systems emerging, and it's getting a lot more complicated. So one of the things I talk about in my events is that, many different types of things can be done with a blockchain or with a distributed ledger, but we need to kind of understand what the different technologies are and where they can be useful and what the risks are of each type of system. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but as I mentioned, Bitcoin was really kind of the first blockchain. It's a public blockchain, so it's open source, which makes it permissionless. This is one of these weird words you get in kind of cryptocurrency circles. I never understood what that meant for the first probably 6 months that I was finding out about Bitcoin, but it means you don't really need anyone's permission to be part of it. So anyone can get involved, anyone can build something with Bitcoin, anyone can be part of the network. So it's a bit like the internet, it's an open system. But you can also build your own private distributed ledgers if you like. So it's more like an intranet. You can create your own system. Might be within a company, it might be within a group of companies. And now we're starting to move to kind of these cross-industry collaborations, different kinds of hybrid projects, different ways of achieving this kind of so-called consensus on a network, which allows you to essentially have that truth, to know that what you said was done has actually been done and that the system agrees on one version of the truth. Next slide, please. So I see this as being, a huge revolution. It's not just about blockchain as a technology that can help make things more efficient in existing industries. I think it can certainly do that. But, I would like banks to work more efficiently, but that's not my main driver of why I'm interested in blockchain. I think you get this kind of whole wave of innovation. You've got another layer of the internet, which is not just the internet of information, where you can go on a website and you and I essentially can be peer-to-peer in real time seeing the same information. But we can also exchange value securely, and we can know that we can trust each other to do that. And then you start to bring in tokens, you start to bring in a kind of decentralized web, and we talked already a little bit about initial coin offerings, but you're getting the growth of different types of tokens to do different types of things, and that might be a fundraising mechanism for startups, like an initial coin offering, but it might also be a token that's used within a network to offer certain services, and then you can start to unlock value for people in different ways by using those tokens. So cryptocurrencies or tokens and blockchains are kind of interacting with each other in different ways, creating different types of innovations. And this is very much part of this fourth industrial revolution, which we're talking about in this series of talks. It's more than just blockchain, it's also other technologies converging with blockchain. So we already mentioned smart contracts, things like AI. When you start to connect all these technologies together, and even, blockchain itself is really more than one technology. It's a set of technologies that kind of came together at the same time. You get some very, very exciting things going on. So where are we now in terms of implementation? It's still pretty early days for blockchain, to be honest. There are actually over 100 government blockchain projects around the world, which people might be surprised to know. Everything from some small voting pilots to pilots for issuing welfare benefits, medical record projects, dealing with issuing passports. There are a number of countries that have set targets to put all their government documentation on the blockchain by 2020. I think Dubai is one of the most famous, but others have followed suit. So we're building it up, but it's still pretty early days. But you can start to see now lots of real-world use cases and examples of blockchain, whether it's in the public or in the private sector. So these are some of the countries that are kind of leading the way in terms of implementing blockchain in the public sector, or setting targets at least for using blockchain. I think that UK is kind of doing some great things. I mean, the Financial Conduct Authority sandbox was mentioned, and I think that's great. It's been a great way for people to learn about what's going on and for companies to experiment without fear of being sort of breaking any laws or sort of going against regulation. But I think, you know, the other B word has stifled us a little bit. I'm hoping that that's going to change. I know there's a lot of great people in politics and in business who are really trying to push this forward in the UK, and I hope that London will continue to be kind of a fintech hub and a hub for blockchain companies. These are just some of the examples of things that are going on, things that I look at in my events. Protection of intellectual property rights is an interesting area for creators. I did a big event in June called Creatives Unblocked, where we looked at how blockchain might help people protect their creative works in music or film or other areas. Also in the art market, there's a lot of applications of blockchain in the art world for provenance and so on of goods. Supply chains is interconnected, but again, it may seem boring, but there's a lot of things that we do in supply chains that affect us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it might be just, you know, trying to prevent health scares from food, but it might also be, you know, radical cutting down of costs of the way we do business. And I know that there's a lot of really interesting projects going on in that area. And I think data management in a way is probably the thing that cuts across all of these different things. How can we manage data, and how can we maybe use distributed systems as a sort of spine for managing how we sort and segment data? Nevertheless, it's not kind of easy. I mean, Jimmy Song's a famous kind of investor and speaker about blockchain, and he used this expression blockchain dust, which I really like, because a lot of people sort of say, well, you know, blockchain can cure cancer and it can do this and it can do that and it can do everything, you know, and there's all kinds of sort of crazy projects you hear about, you know, which, you know, we have social problems we're not going to be able to fix with blockchain because they're just part of our society, but there are some things that we can do. But trying to be clear about what it is and define it, I think, is an important point. Finding out what you can use blockchain for or distributed ledgers for and what you can't, because you can't just suddenly say, oh, I'm going to do a blockchain project no matter what I'm trying to do. If you have a problem you think would be suited to be solved by a distributed project, then maybe that's the way to look at it, and then you start to go through a framework and try and identify what the problems are and whether this is really something you should be doing. And there are a lot of roadblocks when blockchain gets real, so I spend a lot of time talking about things, boring things maybe for some people, but things like standards, things like whether blockchains can work together with each other. So if you have a whole bunch of these different systems, how can they talk to each other, sort of plug into each other, if they can or not. And there's quite a lot of much more technically expert people than me working on those kind of things. And then the real thing is change management. This is a huge change in the way we think. And for most people, it's still really off-putting and they don't really understand what it is. So I think that the Tapscott book was great, not just because it was a kind of a mainstream book about blockchain, but also because it paints blockchain as this much wider thing. It's about how we can change the world for the better. And I do really like the idea that, you know, when we move away from doing these kind of paper systems, it will not just be about having, you know, more efficient ways of doing things, but actually it's human pain. You know, if I have to keep going along into a post office of all things, you know, in the 21st century and signing my name and taking my paper council tax bill to go and just prove who I am to my government, I think that that's a sign that we haven't evolved and we haven't moved on the technology that we've got. You know, I don't have ownership of my own healthcare data. I don't think that, you know, I probably even know where it is. It's probably, you know, on a kind of bunch of pieces of paper in a folder in a warehouse somewhere in another part of the UK. I might like to know what's in there. I might like to correct what's in there. I might like to know where my children's medical data is. There's lots and lots of things that I'm not empowered to do in current systems, which I think that blockchain can help us to change. So if you want to build a career in this, I know we haven't got long left, so I'm going to cover this just briefly, and I know some of these things have already been covered, but I do think that skills you have can add value. You don't have to be a financier. I'm not from the banking world. I'm not a techie. I got into this because I thought that my kind of communication skills and my business development skills and my policy background would be of added value. And it took a while before other people started to agree with me, because in those days, first of all, no one knew who I was in the blockchain world, and also, the companies were very, very small, but now things are starting to evolve. So people with skills in communications, in marketing, in event management, in other areas are getting involved in blockchain. Do get involved in networks and partnerships. It's a very encouraging, I think, and friendly space, and I've really found a lot of great friendships and new relationships I've built through doing it. And try and think about what your niche is, because there's a lot of things you could be doing. There's many, many aspects of blockchain. So what is it you really care about? It might be humanitarian causes. It might be that you're very, very good in finance. It might be that you're very, very good in the insurance sector. Whatever it is, find out what your niche is and try and build on that, because I think that's a way to stand out. I think some of these things have been mentioned already, but I would encourage you to read, or if you don't like reading, listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos. There's so many resources out there now, and meetups I think can also be great, because you get a chance to meet some incredible people who are still really willing to come to events. I mean, some of the biggest names in the industry will come to meetups. Back in the early days when I was doing this, I met leaders of some of the major kind of Bitcoin companies and people in the field who just came along and came and had a beer in a basement somewhere in East London. And it's still happening now. We're all here in a basement in East London having a beer. And hopefully you'll get a chance to meet people you wouldn't have otherwise met. And that's really the best way to ask questions. So do come and ask me more questions at the end if I haven't covered everything. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've kind of got to demystify a little bit about what blockchain is. And if you haven't, you can also come to any of these other places to find out. So thanks so much for having me. And I think we're now going to the other B, which is the beer. So.
Well, beer. Give it up for Helen Disney. Thank you.